This week, we're in the middle of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, and it's the last episode of this podcast for this year. So I just want to spend a moment reflecting on the experiment that is this podcast and the Jewish news story that, at least for me, underlies all the other bits of news I've covered so far. A thank you is also in order to all of you, the listeners. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So look, number one is I want to thank everyone who has tuned in to listen to this podcast this year, and to Jewfolk Inc. for hosting The Jews Are Tired. A Jewish news podcast had been rattling around in my head for the past year or so, but I was never sure about doing it until a few friends encouraged me to see what happens. And even then, I had no idea what a weekly digest of Jewish news would or should look like, and if anyone would bother listening to it at all. So everything has been an experiment with this. An experiment in trying to provide news and analysis, but not making it overwhelming like so much of the news cycle feels nowadays. An experiment in making a Jewish podcast about news, not just a podcast about Jewish news, going so far as to read a Yom Kippur prayer for the victims of the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, and reading A New Colossus by Emma Lazarus on this podcast. It's been an experiment in balancing my perspective and analysis of events, but trying to be objective in explaining what exactly might have happened in any given week. Which brings me also to the underlying story of this podcast and the news we cover. The Jews Are Tired exists in a context where Jewish media is seriously struggling. Just like many newspapers across the U.S., Jewish newspapers over this past decade have lost a lot of funding that used to come from print advertising, and it's been difficult to convince people that Jewish news and Jewish journalism or Jewish media at all is worth paying for. And I've seen this story from a number of different angles. I am a Jewish journalist who has worked for Jewish media, and I've reported on the mismanagement and loss of money that has plagued The Forward, the oldest Jewish news source in America, as they became an online-only endeavor. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had after barely 2 years in Jewish journalism about the expiration date so many of us feel in this field. And especially for young journalists, we think through the fact that we're passionate about the work we do, but we aren't sure that there's enough money or job stability to keep us in the job. But even setting that aside, at the end of the day, I'm also just a consumer of Jewish news. And there has been a lot of important reporting happening, from stories about sexual assault and the Me Too movement involving some of the biggest donors in the Jewish world, to stories about LGBTQ Jews and Jews of color and the ways that American Jewry is evolving. And sure, the New York Times or NBC or the Washington Post do stories about Israel and American Jewry or anti-Semitism, but I am comfortable saying that some of the best and most insightful journalism about our community comes from our community. And a whole lot of what makes this podcast possible is the reporting and analysis done by a lot of great Jewish journalists. At the end of the day, if the thesis of this podcast is Jewish news you can understand and that won't drive you totally crazy, part news and part fireside chat, the thesis is also that knowing about what happens in our community is good, because more informed Jews make for better Jewish community understanding and decision-making. But none of this can happen for free. Like Jewish professionals everywhere, journalists can't eat idealism or pay for gas or rent with our next story or program pitch or the next podcast episode. So I want to circle back to the thank yous, because the fact that anyone at all has bothered to listen to this podcast and then kept listening to it, I think is amazing. To me, that feels like this podcast does matter, even if it's just a weekly digest of Jewish news that people can hopefully come to learn something and to feel a little less terrible about the news cycle. So really, and again, thank you. And I'll just add that if you believe in any of what I'm saying here, come support Jewish journalism. I'm not good at asking for money, but it's just a reality that this work isn't free. So be it any amount to Jewfolk Inc., which this podcast is affiliated with, or any other Jewish news source, all I can ask is that if you believe in it, come support it. And now, because every podcast is an experiment, I want to leave you for this year with another poem by the great Jewish writer Emma Lazarus, who wrote the poem engraved on the base of the Statue of Liberty. This one is in the spirit of Hanukkah and is called The Banner of the Jew. Wake, Israel, wake. Recall today the glorious Maccabean rage, the sire, heroic, hoary gray, his fivefold lion lineage, the wise, the elect, the help of God, the burst of spring, the avenging rod. From Mitzpeh's mountain ridge they saw Jerusalem's empty streets, her shrine laid waste where Greeks profaned the law with idol and with pagan sign. Mourners in tattered black were there, with ashes sprinkled in their hair. Then, from the stony peak there rang a blast to ope the graves. Down poured the Maccabean clan, who sang their battle anthem to the Lord. 5 heroes lead, and following see 10,000 rush to victory. Oh, for Jerusalem's trumpet now, to blow a blast of shattering power, to wake the sleepers high and low, and rouse them to the urgent hour. No hand for vengeance, but to save, 1,000,000 naked swords should wave. O deem not dead that martial fire, say not the mystic flame is spent. With Moses' law and David's lyre, your ancient strength remains unbent. Let but an Ezra rise anew to lift the banner of the Jew. A rag, a mock at first, ere long, when men have bled and women wept to guard its precious folds from wrong, even they who shrunk, even they who slept, shall leap to bless it and to save. Strike. For the brave revere the brave. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.